thought what we would begin with today is I want to present you with the 4 paragraphs of an introduction to a recent paper published in the American Economic Review. And what I want you to do is to put the paragraphs in order. Okay, I'm going to present them to you in a jumbled order. And I want you to put them in the order in which they actually appear in the article. And while you're doing that, I want you to pay attention to what leads you to conclude, oh, this paragraph comes before that paragraph. And that paragraph comes after this one, that kind of thing. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to display on my screen the 4 paragraphs. And let me get to them. Let's see here. Jumbled order. Let's see here. Now, what you should see are, let me just go up. You should see 4 paragraphs. Do you all see that?
Not for me. I think
Not
it's
for
still
you.
showing
Okay.
your
Let
folder.
me figure out what I need to do here. Let me stop the share. Let me go back to the share. Let me go to here. Now do you see it? See the 4 paragraphs?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, what I want you to do is to put these in order. You see that they're numbered. So if you want, you can just send me through the chat the order in which you think these actually appear in the original. And as you do this, I want you to think about what is it about the writing that is leading you to put this paragraph before that paragraph and so forth and so on. So I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to do this. I'll go ahead and set my timer. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to tell you what the actual order is, and we'll talk about some features of the writing. Okay, just a few more seconds. Several of you have already answered. Yeah. So I'm happy to report that all of the answers I received were correct. It was it was 3, 2, 4, 1. So this is the actual order right here. And Derek, do you see, or are you seeing what I hope you're seeing? The first paragraph begins a growing literature on career advancement.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me figure out. Let me see here. All right, hold on just a second. Sorry, guys, this screen sharing is, here we go. Huh. Okay, this should be it here. Okay, now you should see the paragraphs in the actual order in which they appeared in the paper. The first paragraph should begin a growing literature on career advancement. Do you see that, Derek?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So, okay. Let me talk about some features of this introduction that I think will be helpful for you to bear in mind as you write your own introductions. Um, the first thing is it's short. It's only 4 paragraphs long. Okay. Now I cheated a little bit here. I took this introduction from an article in the Papers and Proceedings issue or version of the American Economic Review. And as you may know, the articles in the Papers and Proceedings version of the American Economic Review are the papers that were presented at the most recent AEA conference. And by design, they are short. They're typically 7 or 8 pages long only. And so this is good for you to know because they're kind of like papers in miniature. If you study the papers that appear in the Papers and Proceedings version of the American Economic Review, I think that will help you get a sense of how a fuller paper is supposed to be structured. They're, like I said, they're kind of full papers, but in miniature. So you might find it helpful to study those. Now, even though I cheated, let me emphasize one thing. Even full-length papers with much longer introductions typically will tell you what the paper does very early on. Okay. Most of them, 80%, I would say, 4/5, tell you what the paper does by the beginning of the 3rd paragraph. Many of them tell you in the 2nd paragraph. And of course, there are even some that will tell you in the 1st paragraph. And so my message to you is when you're writing an introduction to your paper, that you get to that point pretty early in the introduction. Definitely by the beginning of the 3rd paragraph, you should be telling your reader what it is you're doing. Okay. Here in this introduction, they do this in the 2nd paragraph, the beginning of the 2nd paragraph. So that's the first thing I want you to take away from this, that not only can an introduction be short, but even if it's a long introduction, you should strive to tell your reader what it is you're doing early on. In the 2nd paragraph, definitely by the beginning of the 3rd paragraph. Okay. If anybody has any questions, just ask me in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. The second thing I want you to notice about this introduction, the authors have done a really good job of breaking their paragraphs. So notice how in at the beginning of paragraph 2 and the beginning of paragraph 4, they begin by referring back to what the previous paragraph just finished saying. So in paragraph 2, they begin in this paper, we fill this gap. What gap? The gap that they just mentioned at the end of the first paragraph. In the fourth paragraph, they begin in line with these findings. What findings? The findings they just reported in the previous paragraph. And when you begin your paragraphs in that way, it helps the reader see at a glance how your introduction is constructed and what the important features of it are. So that's the second thing I want you to take away from this is think about beginning your paragraphs in a way that can signal to the reader the structure of the introduction and what the important elements of the introduction are. Okay. The third thing that I want to point out is, and this overlaps with what I just said, but they're very explicit about what they're doing here. So we fill this gap. Our paper adds to. We show that. Okay. We also find that. So this is what's known as meta discourse or meta language. And it's very important in academic writing where you explicitly label your findings, you explicitly label your contribution, you explicitly label your argument, those kinds of things. Okay. Now, another thing I want to point out. Look at the second paragraph. So as I believe I mentioned in the first workshop, the beginning of a clear style in English, and maybe in other languages too, is a short subject followed immediately by a verb. Okay? A short subject followed immediately by a verb. So look at paragraph 2. We fill. Short subject followed immediately by a verb. We document. Short subject followed immediately by a verb. We examine. Short subject followed immediately by a verb. Okay? So I want you to notice that. Now, do they do that every time? No, they don't. And I'm not saying you have to do that every time. I'm just saying that the beginning of a clear style is a short subject followed by a verb. Okay, one more thing I want you to notice about this introduction. So if I ask economists to describe economics writing, what they usually tell me is objective, no metaphors, no rhetoric, no flowery language. That's what they tell me. Well, that's not entirely true. Economists typically use subjective words, value-laden words in building a case for what it is they're doing, okay? And so if we look at this introduction, hold on, there's a question in the chat, so let me go to it. Okay. Yep, great. Thanks, Derek. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Look how they begin. A growing literature. Okay. Well, growing is at least quasi-judgmental, quasi-interpretative, right? They see a growing literature where someone else could possibly see just a fairly stagnant literature, who knows? Most of the literature, okay, these are subjective judgments, subjective statements, interpretative statements that the authors are making, phrases, I should say, that the authors are using to build a case for what they're doing. Here's another example right here. Whoops. We know much less about. Okay. And here's the most here's another example, maybe especially important. Okay. So I'm just telling you that that in building a case for what you're doing, which is one of the things you want to do in an introduction, you typically have to resort to these words and phrases that are subjective. I mean, they're a matter of interpretation. Okay, matter of interpretation. Okay. Questions or comments about this? If you do, put them in the chat. Okay, bonus instruction. Let's focus on this opening sentence here. Let's focus on this. This is bonus instruction here. Okay, so this sentence begins, a growing literature on career advancement in economics examines barriers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. This is a sentence written by academics for academics. And I know that because it begins by referring to the literature. I would venture to say that you look in any popular magazine and look at any feature story in that magazine, you will probably never find one that begins by referring to a body of studies. Okay. This is an academic sentence written only for academics. Now, people will often say to me, how do I reach a broader audience? Well, there's an easy first step to reaching a broader audience, and that is you focus on people rather than things. So not the literature, but the people who are writing this literature, right? So, for example, we're going to just get rid of that. And we're going to go here. More and more economists are examining barriers to promotion among women in academia. Okay. Simply by that shift from the literature, which is a thing, to economists who are flesh and blood actors, you're immediately going to make this more amenable to a broader audience with that shift alone. Okay. Can we do better? Yeah, we can do better. So again, if you want to connect with a broader audience, generally speaking, the more specific and concrete you can be, the better. Okay. Economists is it's an improvement. It makes this more accessible to a broader audience because economists represent people rather than things. But if you want to make this even more accessible, get a little more specific. Do you see this citation, Chevalier, or maybe it's Chevalier, probably 2021? Okay, That's academic notation right there, right? That's an in-text citation. People who are not in academia, they don't know what that would look weird to them. But Chevalier is the author of a study. I'll look this up. I looked her up. And here's how you can make this even more accessible to a general audience. You can do this. Whoops, let me get the date right. Spell her name right. Now, I would argue that this this makes it even more accessible to a general audience, because now you're focusing not on a group of people, economists, but on a very specific person at a very specific place who was asked to prepare a very specific report. So that's how, those are some of the things you can do to, if you're ever interested in a broader audience or writing in a more accessible way, is focus more on people and specifics. Okay, that's the way to do that. Questions or comments about that? Right. Yeah. Okay. So Enoch has a question. Does that work well if you have a word limit? It sounds a bit longer. It is longer. And this is what I often have to say to people is if you want to write for a broader audience, you often have to use a little more language than you do when you're writing for fellow specialists. And in terms of a word limit, yes, if you have a word limit, then you have to make choices about what you keep, what you don't keep. So yeah, yes, it is a little bit longer, but is that extra length worth the added accessibility? That's what you have to decide. Other questions? Okay. Whoops. Did I just lose you all? No. How did this get here? I don't want that. Okay. All right. So the rest of our time, I'm going to comment on some writing samples that two of you sent in. And I'm going to try to do this in a way that will be useful for everybody. So even if you're not, even if this writing sample is not yours, I'm going to try to talk about it in a way that I hope will be helpful to you. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is by Seathal Davis. Seathal, I believe you are here. I think I saw you. Are you here with us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sending this in. One question right off the top is what you sent me the entire introduction?
No, that's something that I'm working on.
Okay, okay. It's not the entire introduction.
Yes, not entire.
Okay, okay. Let me put it up on the screen so everyone can see it. Let me close this for the moment and let me just hold on, just bear with me Share screen. There it is. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me first of all, Seethal, make sure that I understand what it is you're trying to do. Okay. So you've got this situation where in Kerala, 55% of representatives are women. And what I think what you're trying to figure out is, in order to have time to be a representative, to function as a representative, these women have to allocate their time in certain ways so they can free up enough time to function as representatives. And what you're trying to figure out is how they allocate their time and how that allocation enables them to do what they need to do as a representative. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, sir. It's
Okay. Okay. Let me ask you this. So, and this is a comment for everybody in the audience. Usually, the question that you're trying to answer is a question that the secondary literature has raised. It's a question that is out there in the literature that needs an answer, that needs further evidence, that needs additional support, or whatever it might be. Let me ask you this, Seethal. Tell me how the question you are pursuing, how does that relate to the existing literature on this subject?
okay. The thing is that when I went through the literature, what I found is that mostly women representatives, as you said, as I mentioned here, is that more than 50%. There is 50% of reservation, but still the representation of women is higher. And the thing is that mostly women, most women are housewives. This is I gathered from literature. And other thing is that we have literature in labor economics saying that mostly women do not enter to labor market because of their unpaid work.
So they have to
Okay.
do work in the home, so they don't have time to go work for a company or something like that.
Something.
Mhm.
But the for elected representatives, it is not a normal job, right? It is not a regular job kind of timing. All things are different. You need more time to be excel in this field, right? So there is that. And what I gathered from literature is that mostly housewives are the elected representatives. So some kind of, I believe something is there.
Okay, yeah. So at the end of the sample that you sent me, the question that I was left with was how this does fit into the literature. So what I would definitely, I would suggest contextualizing the question that you ask in the context of the literature. And so maybe the first two paragraphs can be condensed into just one. And then the second paragraph, you can get into the literature that points to, or that leads to, or that opens up the question that you ask. So let me ask you a couple more questions, because I'm a little I'm not sure I completely understand. So you ask, how do non-employed married women take part in elected representation? And I guess my reaction would be, well, they're not employed, thus they have time to take part in elected representation. But that apparently is not the answer. Um, so I guess you're still looking for the answer, right? Or have you found an
Yeah.
answer? You're still
No,
looking.
no, I didn't.
Okay.
I'm still looking.
Okay. And I guess to me the answer would be, well, they're not employed, that therefore they have time. Why would that not? That seems like an obvious answer. Why do you think that's actually not the answer? What else do you think is going on here?
Maybe there might be more, they might be taking simultaneous activities. You are allocating time. You are allocating time to your political activities, personal activities, or you are allocating time according to the needs. But the thing is that women may experience more time stress, or maybe they are doing more than one activity at a given time.
Okay. Is there a large literature on, I think there is actually a large literature on time allocation?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to think of what would be the literature to situate this in. Let me ask you one more question. Why the focus on Kerala, and why is the comparison between Kerala and India as a whole, as opposed to Kerala and other states of India?
Because here representation is higher. Women representation in local governance is higher in Kerala.
Okay. And so,
but you cannot see women in other political activities.
say that one more time.
Understand?
I'm sorry.
We see more women in elected representation. But we are not seeing more women in, usual political activities. If you have any strikes, demonstrations, you are not seeing that much women in that area.
Okay. All right.
Well, I think direct answer.
Yep.
Want to say something?
So yeah. So I mean, I think I wish I had your whole introduction because that might have been helpful. The question, yeah, I mean, because the questions that I came away with was, how does this relate to the literature? Why Kerala? And so you tell me that, so Kerala has a higher percentage of women in representation than other states. I think, you need to say that explicitly and explain why that makes Kerala particularly suitable to look at. So for example, Kerala has 55%. What about is there a state that has 52%? You know, and if so, why is Kerala, I mean, that sounds like a insignificant difference to me. So why Kerala as opposed to this other state if such a state exists? But anyway, those are my comments on this. I wish I had had the whole introduction because then I might have been able to it would have been helpful to have the whole introduction. Because at this point,
Maybe
at this point,
maybe I will send to you after I complete. Is that okay?
yeah, that's okay. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Paul, I wanted to
Yes.
ask a question which
Yes.
might be beneficial in line with the existing discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Have you, in your review of writing advice, encountered anyone giving a framework for economists or researchers more broadly on how they can think about the types of research gaps and how each type of research gap triggers a sort of justification or information that a researcher should include in, you know, why this research gap is important. The reason why I say this is because I've asked myself this question, and I think I have a place that I note down, you know, different writing advice, and I remember I took note of, I don't know where I got this from, but I noted down that research gaps, at least in economics, could fall into 4 categories. Either you are developing a new theory, or you are using an existing theory, but then you're adding a new term that wasn't there before, or you are using an existing model, but then adding a new empirical method to it.
Yep.
Or you're using an existing model, an existing method, but in a new context.
New data.
Yeah, new data, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you encountered anything like that that maybe that might be useful for the others? It sounds like Sita's research falls in the 4th category, applying, you know, new existing methods in a new context. So then, you know, she should explain why this context is interesting. Maybe that might be helpful for the others.
Yeah. So, well, let's ask Seathal that. So, Seathal, Derek just mentioned what you say, Derek, makes perfect sense to me. Seathal, Derek just mentioned 4 kinds of gaps. There's basically a new theory. There's a modification to an existing theory. There's a modification to an existing methodology, or there's a modification to the data. What do you see as the kind of gap that you're trying to fill here? Yeah, maybe we've lost Seathal. I don't know. I do need to move on because I believe we only have until 11, right, Derek?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So let me move on to the next paper. But I mean, you're exactly right. I don't know of any document or book that explicitly lays out what you just said, but what you just said is exactly my understanding of of the categories that gaps fall into. Okay. All right, one more paper, and I can go over a little bit. That's okay. Let me close this. And let me stop sharing for the moment. And then I'm going to have difficulty pronouncing the names of our 2 authors here, Qiang and Zechen. And I hope that they're both here. Let me look at the list of participants.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Is it Zechen?
Yes. My name's Chen.
Zechen. Okay, great. So I have a lot of annotations on your paper. Let me display it so people know, at least they'll have some idea of what your paper is about. Screen. Okay. And there's the abstract that people can see. Okay, Zechen, let me begin just like I did with Seathal and see if I understand what it is you're trying to do, okay? This is what I think you're trying to do. There's this data out there from the SPF, the Survey of Professional Forecasters, and the Federal Reserve's Green Book. And that data shows that our forecasts of inflation are usually wrong. They usually have errors. What you want to do is construct a model that fits that data. Now, other people have tried to do this, but they usually assume that, let's say, the central bank and the private sector have access to the same forecasts, that is, the same information. But as you point out, in the real world, that's just not true. So what you do is construct a model in which the central bank and the private sector have different information. So the central bank has one set of information, the private sector has a different set of information. And the model that you construct better fits or represents the data found in the SPF and the Green Book. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, you are.
Okay, that's good. Now, I have to say, I had to read this several times to get to that point. And let me see if I can help you understand why. And help the rest of the group learn some things about writing. Before I comment on specific parts of your paper, let me ask you, Zechen, what in your mind is your primary contribution here? What is the one thing you want people to take away from your paper? Zechen?
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
I have a
Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Did I let me pose my question again. What in your mind is the main contribution of your paper? That is, what's the one thing you want people to take away from this?
From my perspective, I think the existing literature primarily focus on the potential factors that drive bias in private sector. Well, the approach I take here not only solve the private forecast. I mean the pattern we see in private forecast, but also the forecast errors of the central bank, and this kind of friction endogenize these the forecast error of two sectors.
So that last statement was this kind of friction endogenizes the errors of the two sectors?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, that'll be helpful for me to keep in mind as we work through this. So the existing literature, let me just make sure I understood that correctly. The existing literature does a good job dealing with the private sector. What you do is not only deal successfully with the private sector, but also with the central bank. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. All right, let's take a look. I found the abstract to be very helpful. And it was much easier for me to understand the abstract than the introduction to the paper. And let's talk about some things in the introduction. First of all, just in case you're wondering, the English gave me no trouble. Okay, so that's not an issue here. Let me take you through how my experience of reading the paper and see if this is helpful. So in the first case, early on in the first sentence, you have what's known as a noun cluster. In this case, 4 nouns, one right after the other. For whatever reason, this is not a cluster that's familiar to me. Okay. It may be a very common phrase in the literature, but for some reason, my sense of rhythm expected this to end with the word forecast. But then there was one more word, error. And so that was the first thing that sort of gave me trouble. So how would this have what would make this easier for someone like me? Well, if you look, let me see. Can you see my screen? Let me just make sure do you see on
Yeah,
the okay,
the comments.
yes, do you see the comments? And I'm going to highlight right here. And maybe this will help you understand why this gave me trouble. And so if you were to begin like this, economic agents routinely make errors when predicting inflation. To make matters worse, at least for economic methodologists, the errors are strongly autocorrelated and biased over subperiods. Again, it's longer, but letting the information unfold like that would have been a little bit easier for somebody like me, but you may not be writing for somebody like me, okay? Regarding that first question, regarding that first sentence, what's more important here, the error or the fact that it's autocorrelated and biased? So Zeshan? Yep.
Yes.
So in this first sentence, what's more important, the fact that there is forecast error or the fact that it's autocorrelated and biased?
Bias.
Okay, good. Well, that's then this sentence is, I think, written in the way it needs to be. Now, your second sentence directs our attention to figure 1. Okay. Now, it's possible in the literature that you are writing for, it's very common to very early on refer a reader to a figure. But generally speaking, I don't think it's standard to refer to a figure or a table so soon in a paper. And you have to keep in mind that when you refer to a figure, your reader is probably instinctively going to turn to that figure. And moreover, that figure is probably not going to be on the same page. So by referring to this figure here, you're kind of disrupting or breaking the reader's attention, I would guess, right? I mean, that's the first thing I did. When I read figure 1, I immediately went to the figure without even thinking. You know, so you immediately took me away from the narrative to this figure. And I'm looking at the figure and I say, okay. So then I come back to the paper. Let me ask you this. This sentence here that I just highlighted, the persistently positive forecast error existed before the early 1980s, after which it persistently shifted to negative error around 2000. Is that what the figure is showing?
Yes.
Okay. So I would open this sentence with as the figure shows, or the figure shows that. Just explicitly tell the reader that this is what they're looking at in the figure. Okay.
So they don't really have to turn to the figure 1. Is that what you mean?
No, so they know clearly that what you were telling them is what they should be seeing in the figure.
Ah,
Yeah. They're going to turn to the figure anyway, it would be my guess. But what wasn't clear to me was whether or not this sentence I'm highlighting right here was telling me what the figure was showing me, or was just a statement independent of the figure. And so to make it crystal clear that this is what the figure is showing, I would begin this sentence with, as the figure shows. Now, here's another thing that gave me trouble. This character, this non-rational agent forecasts seem to come out of the blue to me. Up until this point, the words non-rational the word non-rational had not been used. And so I had trouble figuring out how this connects to what you've already told me. And that was a source of trouble for me. This is like a new word, a new piece of information that I didn't know how to relate to what I had just finished reading.
okay.
Yeah. So yeah, what I concluded after thinking a little bit about this was that people who make forecast errors are non-rationals. But I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, that's the one connection I was able to make, but it might not be an accurate connection. Okay. Now you end this paragraph with, most of the research assumes that economic agents and the monetary authority share the same forecast, which is inconsistent with empirical evidence. And if Seathal is still with us, and she may not be, this is what I was talking about. This is an example of situating what you do in the context of the literature. This is what I'm talking about. And this is what I thought was missing from the excerpt from Seathal's paper. But Zeshan, you have it here. This is great. But let me tell you that what this does is it leads me. So my expectation now is that you are not going to assume this, that you are going to assume instead that they do not share the same forecast. Okay, that's the expectation this sets up in me. So let me ask you, is that indeed what you do? Do you indeed set up a situation in which the agents and the monetary authority have different forecasts?
Yes, that's our attention.
Perfect. Then that's good. That's good. Okay. Getting into this second paragraph, first of all, you get to what you're doing. We present a novel framework with adaptive learning early in the paper. That's great. That's what I like to see. And earlier I talked about short subjects followed immediately by verbs. You do a good job of that in this paragraph. We present, our model introduces, the PS has, so forth and so on. All right. Informational differences. Again, this is a new term. I assume that it is the same as different forecasts. Is that correct?
And there are some differences, I admit.
Mm-hmm. So they have different information, but this is not exactly the same thing as the different forecasts.
No, they're not. The differences in information sets lead to the differences in forecast, actually.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, somehow, I mean, up till now, what I've been working with is this notion of forecasts. And then suddenly you start talking about informational differences, and just like non-rational came out of the blue to me, this informational difference sort of came out of the blue to me. Let me see. This is the figure. Okay. What do I have here? Okay. So the reason I asked you what your main takeaway was, is that I had a hard time figuring out what your main finding was. So for example, my first thought was, oh, this is the main finding. The AL model better fits with post-war US data. But maybe it's not, because there are other statements you make in your introduction that were candidates for, oh, this is the main finding, or this is the main point. And I've already asked you what you see as the contribution, the main contribution to your paper. Let's see, I think that's, yeah. So I guess I'm trying to synthesize all of this and give you something that you can take away. And I guess what it would be is think about what you said your main contribution is, and think about the literature that you're responding to, and think about constructing an introduction around those things, and see what you come up with. Have you gotten other comments on this paper? Have you showed it to other to colleagues and have you presented this at conferences, at workshops?
Yes, but they're presented as the presentation slides, I mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Right.
so
Yeah. So you've made presentations on this before using slides, but
Yes,
you haven't given this paper to other people to read yet, or have you?
I did, because
Okay.
I submit to some journals before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you've been revising this in line with the comments that you've gotten, right?
Yes,
Okay. All right, good. And right now it's under review by an Elsevier journal. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay, great, great. That's terrific. When do you expect to hear from them?
I am expecting someone accept my paper.
Yes. What's right? Okay, good. Well, I hope that the decision is positive. It's most papers that are accepted will go through at least one round of revision. So, what you may get back is a request to make some revisions for the paper on the paper. But I'm, you know, the audience that you're writing for probably didn't have the same struggles that I had, would be my guess. And so, if it gets accepted, then that's great. Thank you for sharing this, Zetchen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your comments. I recognize that there are some big jump from some nouns to some other nouns, so making it difficult for you. I mean the audience that in some other subfield to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I would just be, so there's a principle of writing that says you go from the old to the new. You begin sentences with old information, you end sentences with new information. And so one of the things that I had trouble with in your paper was new information would appear at the beginning. So the first part where that really hit me was this non-rational agent forecast. The concept of the non-rational agent had not been mentioned before this point. I wasn't necessarily expecting it. And so my thinking is, okay, how does that relate to what I've just read? Is it that people who make forecast errors, are they the non-rational ones? Is that what's going on here? So just be aware of that kind of stuff. Same thing with informational differences. You've been, up until this point, you've been talking about forecasts, forecast error, agent forecasts, economic agents and monetary authorities shame the same forecast. And then all of a sudden, you're talking about informational differences. And I'm thinking, okay, does that mean, is that the same as different forecasts? Is this just another way of saying the same of what she's been talking about all along? Or is this a completely new thing? So it's those kinds of things that can give a reader trouble, especially someone like me who's not in this literature. There is a question in the chat, and it refers to the question, Diana is asking, it refers to the question of what I asked Seathal, which is why Kara law? So yeah, this, it's you're usually expected to somehow make the case for why you're focusing on a particular population, a particular time period, a particular location. There's got to be some reason that makes it particularly suited to answer the question that you're trying to answer. That's the reason. And it's a very common kind of question. So you should expect to get it when you're making presentations. Let me stop sharing this. You should expect to get that kind of question when you're making presentations. I remember once I attended a presentation about healthcare in Colorado, the American state of Colorado. And at the end of the presentation, I said, well, why Colorado? Oh, Colorado has this great data with all this information. I said, you've got to tell us that. You know, that's the whole point of the paper, that you've got this great data from Colorado, right? So yeah, so you usually have to, you know, there has to be a good reason why you're focusing on a particular period or location or population. And then you explain what that reason is. Other questions or comments before we adjourn?
I have
Well,
one.
yeah.
Paul, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. In your introduction at the first paragraph, I think the first one, there was a lot of references. So I was wondering if the introduction we have to put the references, or do we have to wait until the literature review, or how you manage the references to the previous literature?
Yeah, well, reference citations do not have to wait for the literature review proper. It's you know, it really depends on the narrative you're constructing and when it's appropriate to cite other sources. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule about that. But were you thinking about, Diana, the AER paper, or no?
Yeah, the first one. Yeah.
Oh yeah, let me get to the yeah. So let me let me find that. Yeah. So remember with this paper, it was from the papers and proceedings. Get back to where we are here. It was from the papers and proceedings, which are short. Basically, they're articles in miniature. And so you sort of have to you have to fit the literature review into the introduction, and that's what they were doing there. But it's not uncommon at all to, before you get to the actual literature review, to refer to pieces of literature. It just depends on what your needs are. You know, do you need to cite something at this point? And you can certainly, you know, most papers respond to a very particular part of the literature, or there's a particular part of the literature that is more important than others. And I've often seen papers early on refer to that literature before they get into the main literature, you know, the literature review proper. So you see that happen as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Seathal, are you still there? Because she may have left us, because I really wanted her to see what I was talking about in that sample from Zetchin. Diana, you have another. Diana Soero has a question. Go ahead,
Yes.
Diana.
I would like to ask if you could provide any guidance concerning references for writing theoretical papers in economics, or for papers who adopt a multidisciplinary approach, for example, economics and philosophy, or economics and, I don't know, any other social science. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. My impression is that, first of all, theoretical works. What's interesting about a lot of theory papers is they often begin by stating what they're going to do. This paper presents a new model of, or this paper presents a model of with this modification. I don't know if there's a different way of handling citations in those papers than in, say, empirical papers. there's not one that I've noticed. I mean, maybe there is one, I don't know, but not one that I've noticed. So
Not specifically citations, how to structure it if you need. So I'm trying to, because we understand that there's a rule and a very specific structure to write a paper. But sometimes when you want to take an approach in economics that is, how can I say, freer than, for example, if you work with a strict orthodox methodology, numbers, graphic equation, something like that, what does it change structure wise? What impact does it have? Or it doesn't have any impact and you just follow the same rules? What's your object of research? What's your main question? Existing literature gap, and it's all the same.
Mhm. I don't know, actually. What I want to answer is that the structure should really arise from the requirements of your project and your narrative. But as you know, a lot of economics papers follow a particular kind of format. To what extent can you deviate from that format? That's one of the things you're asking, right? To what extent can you
Successfully deviate?
Successfully, yeah.
Because often when you take an approach that it's not a methodological approach that does not match the expectations of mainstream economics,
Right.
immediately you're in a disadvantage point. And then, of course, if you are not working within the orthodox model, you want to present and say things that are not expected by mainstream economics.
Mhm.
So my question would be if there is a guide or a good example, I would say that you would say like, wow, this is definitely not orthodox economics. It was published in a journal and it's very robust by the way it's, because if the structure is very good, you can get away more easily with the fact that you're not following the methodology by the book. So that's the.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the non-mainstream literature to really answer that question. I would say this to anybody. I would say that you, as much as possible, shop your paper around, get people to read it and comment on it and present it at conferences and seminars and things like that. But I don't know. I don't know how to successfully do that. Maybe someone in the audience does. Does anyone have an answer here? It's unfortunate, but a lot of I mean, it's hard to do something that's not standard. It's hard to do it and get away with it. We all know that.
Exactly, but
I don't have an answer. I don't know.
at YSI, that's one of the main difficulties that we feel. We want to try to present something different.
Yeah.
And often it's very hard because you're not following the rules. And if there would be something that would provide a structure, I'm not sure if that's a challenge that one day you yourself would like to take on. But like how can, if you do economics and connect it with some other discipline or a different approach, how could you follow a safe structure that keeps you on the path and at least allows you to be taken seriously what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
That is often the problem, and they dismiss your paper not because there is something wrong with the work from a technical point of view, but because you're not following the rules.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the articles they normally get.
Yeah. So that's So if you come across anytime a good example of that, like wow, this is very good.
I mean, have you? I mean, I assume what you want to do is publish this innovative work in a mainstream journal. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, because that's the
Yeah.
hard, yeah, because you have a lot of people, for example, writing a book or writing an essay or a short essay. But when it comes to an article, you always have to narrow down everything and try to fit that.
Mhm.
And it can't be scientific and it can have a valid rationale behind it, but it doesn't fit the
No.
structure. So editorial tricks, perhaps, to to present it in a safer way. Yeah.
You know.
If you
Yeah,
follow-
I mean, yeah, you know, I don't know. I just
yes.
don't know.
If you ever come across anything like that, or if you think it's
Um,
an interesting challenge to take on, yeah.
well, that's a good, I mean, I wrote that down.
Because I'm familiar with your guide, that it's available, you know, on empirical papers, for example. You have a very safe structure,
Yep.
so that can be very comforting if
Mhm.
you're taking a multidisciplinary approach within economics. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you, Diana, for that question. I'm gonna write this down and see what I can find. Okay. Diana, Soeiro. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? All right, well, let me thank especially Seathal and Zetchin for sharing their writing. And, you know, when I was preparing for this, I sounded all eloquent in my head, but I worry that when I try to talk about this in, you know, live, it just, you know, it doesn't come out as great. But, and then let me thank Diana and Derek for organizing the session today. And we'll have one more in December, and I'm looking forward to that. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Paul. Maybe Derek, you want to say some words before we end the session?
Well, this would have been test case place to talk about the YSI, the INET YSI initiative, which is just a community of students and scholars that hope to look at the economy or the subject of economics with a new critical lens, and so providing tools and a space where we can debate orthodox economic ideas with a new critical lens. And so where I come in is I and Diana help to coordinate. I'm sorry if it's a bit noisy, there's a storm outside. So I and Diana help to coordinate the writing group, which we hope is a community, a support group for struggling writers in economics like myself to produce more clear and effective writing in economics, which is an important tool for economists to have. And so workshops like these are a way in which we try to grow individually as writers and as economists more broadly. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how best to structure this writing group, but for sure, workshops such as these with Paul and maybe others will be one of the ways we hope to do that. So we hope to see you again in December. And I think the date is December the 20th, Thursday. No,
I believe so,
December
yeah.
21st.
Yeah, it's the Thursday.
I'm putting in the chat.
21st December.
I'm putting in the chat a link to a new book on writing for graduate students that I've recently come across that I think is good. Just so people have that. It came out this year. And Diana Solero, I'm gonna follow up on your question and see what I can find.
Great. Well,
Thanks
thank you
again,
so much,
Paul.
everyone.
Really
and
appreciate
Mhm.
it.
see you
And
on
Seethal, you're gonna
next-
send me your full intro. I don't know if you're still here, but send me your full intro.
I think she's here.
Sure, sir.
All righty. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
so much.